When I started Season 10, I had a simple goal of climbing as high as I could and seeing how I stacked up against the best players in the game. At one point, I managed to reach top 231, which is a milestone I was genuinely proud of. Looking back at the chart though, what stands out to me isn't the peak itself, but the journey that led there and everything that happened afterward. The climb was never a straight line, even though it felt that way at times. There were stretches of rapid improvement, long periods where I barely moved, and several painful drops that erased weeks of progress. This season ended up teaching me much more about ranked play than I expected, and most of those lessons came from the mistakes I made rather than the successes I achieved. One of the biggest things I learned is how dramatically diminishing returns affects your rating once you reach the upper levels of the leaderboard. Early in the climb, the ranked experience feels relatively fair because wins and losses have somewhat comparable value. As your rating increases though, the system becomes increasingly unforgiving. There were situations where a single loss would erase the games from 3, 5, or even 9 previous wins. That completely changes the way you have to think about ranked. At that level, climbing is no longer about maximizing the number of games you win, it's about minimizing the number of games you lose. The chart reflects this really clearly because the downward movements are often much steeper than the upward ones, despite requiring far fewer matches. Because losses become so expensive at high ratings, I realized that quality matters far more than quantity. For much of the season, I approached rank with the mindset that playing more games would naturally lead to more progress. While that might be true at lower levels, it becomes a dangerous assumption once every mistake carries significant consequences. Looking back, some of the worst rating losses came from sessions where I continued playing even though I knew I wasn't performing at my best. A single mediocre day can wipe out the gains from a week of excellent days simply because of how the point system works. The lesson I took away from this is that being selective about when I play ranked is actually a competitive advantage. Protecting my performance level is often more important than increasing my total number of matches. This realization naturally led me to another important lesson. Warming up should never be optional. Most days I logged on and immediately jumped into ranked without spending any time preparing. Sometimes I got away with it, but many times I didn't. At higher levels, the small differences in mechanical performance become amplified because everyone else is already operating at a very high standard. Missing a few shots, reacting a little slower, or making one poor decision can easily be the difference between winning and losing a close game. When losses carry the weight of multiple wins, you can see how the small mistakes become incredibly costly. Going forward, I think even a short warm-up session or aim training routine before ranked would provide more value than playing more games with cold hands. Another major lesson from this season involved team composition, particularly mobility. Throughout much of my climb, my teams often lacked the mobility tools necessary to keep pace with the strongest teams in the lobby. At lower levels, you can sometimes compensate for weaker macro play through better team coordination or individual decision making. At higher levels though, the game becomes much more focused on tempo, rotations, and positioning. The best teams consistently arrive at objectives first, reposition quickly, and control the flow of engagement before fights even start. Mobility wasn't just helping them move faster, it was giving them strategic control over the pacing of the entire match. Looking back, I think I underestimated how important mobility was and became way too comfortable with compositions that were familiar rather than optimal, like HHM or even HHH. Moving forward, I want to spend more time experimenting with different team setups and understanding how composition choices affect the overall pacing of a match. Surprisingly, the best decision I made this season had nothing to do with mechanics, aim training, or even the game itself. I started building a private, invite-only Discord server and gradually filled it with reliable players I met through LFG and solo queuing. Throughout the season, I've been able to grow this server to over 100 players where about 80% are above Diamond and 20% are within the top 500. Instead of constantly rolling the dice on finding teammates, I began creating a network of players who were serious about improvement and consistently performed at a high level. This ended up having a massive impact on my ranked experience because it gave me access to better communication, better team chemistry, and more opportunities to discuss strategy outside of matches. More importantly, it gave me a pool of people I could trust when I wanted to play serious games rather than spending time searching for teammates every session or risking everything in solo queue. Looking back, this may have been one of the biggest contributors to my climb because it transformed ranked from an individual grind to a collaborative effort. The most exciting outcome of this community has been our private scrims. We already hosted several full lobby private matches, and they've been some of the most valuable practice I've experienced all season. When an entire lobby is filled with players who are capable of reaching top 500, the quality of the games changes dramatically. Every rotation is punished, every positioning mistake matters, and every team is actively trying to win instead of simply reacting to what's happening around them. I noticed that in these environments, I enter flow state much more easily. The games demand my full attention, and because of that, I learn at a much faster rate than I do in my ranked matches. There really is something incredibly valuable about removing randomness from practice and replacing it with a constant concentrated environment full of strong players. Looking back, I think one of the most underrated ways to improve in competitive games is to deliberately raise the quality of your environment. Most players spend all of their time trying to improve themselves while ignoring the people around them. Building a network of strong players has allowed me to learn from different perspectives, experiment with new strategies, and expose myself to ideas that I would never have discovered alone. This Discord server has effectively become a training ground rather than just a place to find teammates. Going into future seasons, I'm excited to continue growing that community because I think it has the potential to become one of the most valuable tools for long-term improvement. If this season has taught me anything, it's that improvement isn't always an individual process. Sometimes the fastest way to get better is to surround yourself with people who are equally committed to getting better. The chart also suggests something interesting about adaptability. During the periods where my rating plateaued, I often continued playing the same way and using the same approaches that had worked earlier in the season. What I failed to recognize was that the level of competition was changing as I climbed. The strategies that got me to one rating bracket weren't necessarily the strategies needed to advance beyond it. Stronger opponents exposed weaknesses that average opponents never punished. Instead of viewing plateaus as bad luck or evidence that I was stuck, I should have viewed them as indicators that something needed to change. Future climbs will definitely require much more experimentation with team compositions, playstyles, and approaches to the game. I'm now a firm believer that adaptability is what separates players who reach the top from players who remain there. The biggest personal issue I encountered throughout the season was what I call rage queuing. The pattern was incredibly consistent and easy to identify after looking at the chart. I would lose one game, then another, and then convince myself that I needed to keep playing until I earned those points back. The problem was that my motivation shifted from performing well to recovering lost points. Once that happened, my decision making usually deteriorated. I became more aggressive, less patient, and more emotionally invested in every outcome. Instead of treating every match as a separate game, I treated every match as an opportunity to fix the previous one. Unsurprisingly, this backfired almost every single time. Many of the sharp declines on the chart seem to follow that exact pattern. What started as a small setback often turned into a much larger drop because I refused to stop playing. I feel that the emotional desire to recover losses immediately is understandable, but it is also one of the most destructive habits a competitive player can have, especially in this game. When you're frustrated, your ability to assess situations objectively decreases. You begin forcing plays that you wouldn't normally make and start making decisions that are driven by emotion rather than logic. The most frustrating part is that the solution is incredibly simple. If I lose 2 or 3 games in a row and notice my mindset changing, I should just stop for today. Every major collapse on this chart can be traced back to a time where I ignored that rule. One thing that stands out when looking at the graph is how often I spent extended periods hovering around the same rating range. At the time, those stretches felt frustrating because it seemed like I wasn't making any progress. Now, I think those plateaus were actually some of the most important parts of the season. They forced me to confront the limitations of my current habits and skill set. Improvement isn't always visible as a rising graph. Sometimes improvement happens internally while the rating remains relatively unchanged. Those periods gave me opportunities to identify weaknesses that eventually needed to be addressed. Without those plateaus, I probably wouldn't have noticed many of the issues that ultimately caused my decline. Another observation from the chart is that my climb was relatively steady for a long time before becoming much more volatile near the top. From the beginning of the season through roughly the middle portion of the graph, the trend is remarkably consistent. Even when I had bad days, I generally recovered and continued moving upward. It wasn't until I entered the upper level of the leaderboard that the swings became larger and more frequent. That volatility taught me that reaching a high rank and maintaining a high rank are entirely different challenges. The closer you get to the top, the less margin for error exists, and every decision, every session, and every emotional reaction carries more weight than it did before. Perhaps the most important lesson from the entire season is that consistency matters more than peak performance. Reaching top 231 proved to me that I was capable of competing at that level, especially since I had to somewhat consistently beat pro players to get there. What it did improve was that I had developed the habits necessary to stay there. Consistency means warming up before playing, managing emotions during long losing streaks, and knowing when to stop. None of the habits are particularly flashy, but they sustain long-term success. Anyone can have a great day or even a great week. The real challenge is creating systems that allows you to perform well over months rather than just moments. Looking back now, I don't see the season as a story about reaching my peak in the finals. I see it as yet another season-long lesson in how high-level ranked environments actually work. The biggest obstacles weren't mechanical skill or game knowledge. Most of the damage came from my own habits and decisions outside of the match itself. I played before preparing, ignored team composition weaknesses, and continued rage queuing when I should have stopped. At the same time, I proved to myself yet again that I was capable of reaching the leaderboards in whichever game I put my mind to. And I built a community of players that will continue pushing me to improve long after this season is over. My next step will not be to find a way to peak even higher. It will be becoming the kind of player who can consistently stay in Ruby. More than anything else, this season taught me that at the highest levels of ranked play, success isn't about finding more ways to win. It's about finding ways to lose less. Currently, 95% of my viewers don't bother subbing to the channel, and every sub really means a lot for a channel of my size. Thanks a lot for considering. Peace.